were to ask you to picture a city, any major global hubs, say Mumbai or Rio de Janeiro or maybe Nairobi, your mind probably goes straight to the glittering towers, right? The sleek business centers, those perfect postcard waterfronts.
Of course, that's the image we're sold.
But the surprising and really inescapable truth we've found digging through today's sources is that the slum, the informal settlement, is a fundamental, totally integrated part of that global urban texture.
That's the duality, the tension you have to face right away. I mean, these places are so often seen exclusively through this lens of just immense struggle, of abject poverty and, catastrophic systemic failure.
And that's real. We can't ignore that.
Oh, absolutely. That reality is there. Yeah. But at the same time, and this is what's so fascinating in the research, they are also home to unbelievable human innovation.
Right.
A fierce creative sense, powerful community togetherness, and I think this is crucial, a kind of hard-earned smartness that is forged entirely out of necessity, out of survival.
We're diving deep into that exact duality today. Our mission, really, based on this powerful stack of research we've pulled together, is to understand the global scope of these settlements.
Uncover the root causes.
Yeah, the complex and often overlooked root causes, and then look at the unique nature, even the economic engines of some of these mega slum communities.
And finally, evaluate the solutions. What's been tried, what actually works, and what just ends up, displacing the problem somewhere else.
Exactly.
So I think we have to start with context and scale, because this isn't some niche urban problem. This defines global urbanization right now.
It really does.
According to the United Nations, more than 1 billion people. Just think about that number for a second.
Billion.
That's 1 in every 8 people on this planet right now living in a slum.
1 in 8. It's a staggering number to even process.
It is. And we're not talking about just a few random shacks. These are sprawling, improvised cities. They developed in regions seeing such rapid urban growth that the formal government, whether it's lack of funds or experience or just political, it just can't provide adequate or, more importantly, affordable housing for everyone flooding in from rural areas.
So you end up with these hyperdense communities defined by, overwhelming overcrowding, terrible or just non-existent public infrastructure, and this immense daily pressure of poverty.
It's an undeniable crisis of urbanization. And to understand it, we have to start with the very language we use to talk about it.
Okay, so let's unpack this term slum, because as you said, it comes with a lot of historical baggage.
A huge amount.
The sources we looked at point out that simply labeling an area a slum can be a deeply political act.
Oh, absolutely. It's often used by outsiders, developers or officials, as a way to delegitimize the residents' claim to that land.
Especially when that land is strategically valuable and somebody else wants it for, say, a new high-rise.
Exactly. Which is why moving beyond that sort of moralizing label and using a precise functional definition is so important for any serious policy talk.
And the UN has one, a very meticulous one.
They do. They break it down into 5 key criteria. And if an informal settlement lacks even one of these conditions, it's technically classified as a slum dwelling.
Okay, let's slow down and walk through those 5. What's the first one?
First is access to improved water. Second, access to improved sanitation.
Okay, the big infrastructure gaps. That makes sense.
Right, the obvious ones. But here's where it gets really interesting. The third is sufficient living area. The UN standard is basically no more than 3 people sharing the same room.
Wow. So that immediately puts overcrowding at the absolute core of the definition.
It's central. Then, number 4 is housing durability. The structure has to be permanent, on an adequate foundation, something that protects residents from extreme weather.
And the 5th one?
The 5th, and you could argue this is the most profound structurally, is security of tenure.
Security of tenure. We're definitely going to dig into that later, but just briefly, why is that legal concept so critical to the definition?
Because it makes it crystal clear that the problem isn't just physical, it's legal and political. A house can look perfectly solid, but if the person living there has no legal right to that land...
If they live in constant fear of eviction...
then it's a slum. Lacking that security just fundamentally prevents any long-term investment or planning, both from the resident and from the city.
That helps explain the incredible variation we see in these places globally. It's not all just shanty towns.
Not at all. You find this huge spectrum. On one end, you have the haphazard shacks thrown together with whatever people can find.
To scavenged materials.
Right. But on the other end, you have solid, multi-story, sometimes even professionally built concrete buildings that have just deteriorated,
What?
Either because of poor initial quality, a total lack of maintenance funding, or, most commonly, they were just never connected to public utilities like a sewer system or a legal power grid.
So the defining feature is the absence of services and legal protection, not just what it looks like.
Exactly. It's about the system, not the aesthetic of poverty.
And all around the world, there are different words for this. It's not just an English term. The local names often tell you something about how that community was formed, don't they?
That's an essential point. It's this rich, if often painful, glossary. Everyone's heard of the Brazilian favela. In Venezuela, they're called barrios. In French-speaking countries, you'll hear bidonville, which literally means tin can city.
But the Turkish term, gecekondu, that one really stood out in the sources.
It's so specific. Gecekondu translates to landed overnight.
Landed overnight.
Yeah. It describes this unique tradition in Turkey where, often because of massive migration, people would squat on state land and build a house as fast as they possibly could, sometimes literally in one night.
Why the rush?
Because historically, there was a loophole. If they could get the walls and a roof up before the authorities could evict them, they often gained a kind of de facto, a practical legal recognition over time.
So speed created a claim.
It forced the government's hand. Eventually, they'd have to provide services. That term captures a very specific, almost aggressive form of self-settlement driven by policy gaps.
And this whole phenomenon has deep historical roots. It's easy to assume this kind of segregation has always existed.
But the sources show it hasn't. Before the 19th century, it was actually less common. The rich and the poor often lived in the very same districts.
How did that work?
The wealthy would have their grand houses on the main streets, and the poor, the servants, the artisans, the laborers, would live in the smaller service streets and alleys right behind them.
So proximity to work was the organizing principle, not distance from the rich.
Exactly. Proximity to labor. The huge shift came in the 19th century with the Industrial Revolution.
Oh, yeah.
As cities grew massively, chaotically, they became incredibly polluted, crowded, and full of disease. And the wealthy, along with the rising upper middle class, started actively moving out.
They fled the city centers.
They used new transport, like trains, to settle in cleaner, healthier suburbs, leaving the poorer workers behind in these increasingly dense and toxic urban cores.
That sounds exactly like the London that Charles Dickens was writing about.
That's precisely where the term slum is thought to have come from. London's East End, Victorian era. The massive, uncontrolled urbanization tied to the docks and factories created just horrific conditions.
And writers like Dickens forced people to pay attention.
They did. Reformers and authors popularized the suffering, which forced a public response.
And the government didn't just respond with charity, did they? They passed major legislation.
Absolutely. The Public Health Acts were a huge step, but the physical response was slum clearance. You saw these pioneering model housing projects, like the Boundary Estate in Shoreditch, built around 1893.
What was so special about that project?
It was one of the first big state-led housing projects. It was designed to be fire-resistant, well-ventilated, with communal facilities. It really set a benchmark for modern social housing that was copied for decades.
And this wasn't just a British thing. It's easy to forget that the United States had massive slums until, relatively recently.
The U.S. experience is very similar. New York City's 5 Points, established around 1825, is often called the country's first major slum.
And it was built on a swamp, basically.
Literally, it was built on the filled-in ground of the old Collect Pond, which had been polluted by tanneries and slaughterhouses. As waves of immigrants arrived, the Irish, then Italians, the Chinese community, they were forced into these squalid, lightless tenements.
But the 5 Point slum isn't there anymore, so what got rid of it?
It took comprehensive long-term state action, not just tearing it down. 5 Points was eventually transformed through massive urban renewal into what we now know as Little Italy in Chinatown.
So slums were common in the U.S. and Europe well into the 20th century.
They were. And their elimination wasn't just about clearance. It was this powerful combination of the post-World War II public housing boom, the social safety nets from the war on poverty in the 60s, and this is key major infrastructure projects that spread out the population and the jobs.
Which brings us to the present day. Because if the U.S. and Europe managed this, why is a city like Karachi still struggling with this on such an immense scale?
That's the perfect question, because the scale we're talking about today it dwarfs those historical examples.
The populations of these single settlements outstrip most small or even medium-sized cities.
They really do. And if you want the top line, the the one that holds the title of the greatest slum on the planet by populace, that would be Orangi Town in Karachi, Pakistan.
And the numbers there.
The estimates put the population at well over 2.5 million people.
2.5 million.
Just try to get your head around that. That one unplanned neighborhood has a bigger population than entire Western cities like Vienna or, Paris proper.
That's almost an abstract number. Let's try to zoom in on a few of these huge settlements to really understand the unique economies and the ingenuity inside them. And we have to start with the most famous one, Dharavi in Mumbai.
Dharavi is a true phenomenon. It's often called the economic heart of Mumbai. You have nearly 1 million people packed into just 2.1 square kilometers.
1 million people?
The density is just, it's hard to even visualize. It's like taking the entire population of a city like Amsterdam and cramming them into a couple of big city parks.
And the economy there is legendary. You often see this figure, $1 billion economy.
And it's not an exaggeration. The informal economy in Dharavi isn't just large, it's incredibly sophisticated and vertically integrated. The estimate is a daily income that adds up to over $1 billion a year.
And that scale is possible because it's informal.
Precisely. There's no zoning. Your home is also your factory floor, it's your warehouse, and it's your storefront, all in the same tiny space.
So a potter literally lives above his kiln. The textiles he's weaving are sold right out the front door.
Exactly. And you have these highly organized supply chains, especially in recycling, leather goods, pottery. The lack of formal regulation allows for instant reinvestment of capital and super flexible labor. Dharavi recycles something like 80% of Mumbai's plastic waste. It's an industrial powerhouse that completely bypasses formal planning and taxes.
Okay, let's move to Africa. Kibera in Nairobi, Kenya. It's arguably the largest slum on the continent.
Kibera, whose name actually means the big swamp in the Nubian language, is another case of intense density and a profound lack of services.
How many people live there?
The estimates vary wildly, which is part of the problem, but it's somewhere between 200,000 and 1 million people. The density is crushing, over 2,000 people per hectare. And the challenges that creates are just horrifying.
Let's talk about the sanitation crisis there. It's become infamous for the flying toilets.
It's a very stark illustration of extreme deprivation. With almost no access to improved sanitation for most people, residents are forced to use plastic bags for human waste.
And then what?
And then they are thrown onto rooftops, into ditches, or just flung into the air, hence the term. This directly contaminates water sources, and it accelerates the spread of diseases like cholera and drug-resistant.
It's a constant health emergency.
A constant health emergency. And it often gives rise to what they call water cartels, where private groups monopolize access to any clean water and then charge exorbitant prices for it.
Let's go back to Orangi Town in Pakistan, the most populous one. We mentioned its self-reliance. How did 2.5 million people solve an infrastructure problem the government just ignored?
This is an incredible story of resilience. The state completely failed to provide a sewerage system. So the community organized something called the Orangi Pilot Project.
They didn't wait for government engineers?
They didn't wait. They raised their own funds, they organized local engineers and masons, and through this amazing combination of community mobilization and self-help, they successfully laid their own fully functional underground sewer system.
They funded and built their own municipal utility.
Yes, they took ownership. And it's become this global model for how to do self-organized, low-cost sanitation infrastructure. It proves the problem is rarely a lack of ingenuity from the residents. It's a failure of the formal system to support that capacity.
Okay, another example of an economy built on waste, but with even higher health risks. Manshiat Nasser in Cairo, Egypt, the garbage city.
Manshiat Nasser has about 600,000 people, and it's home to the Zabaleen, the traditional, mostly Coptic Christian waste collectors of Cairo.
And they run the whole city's recycling program informally.
They do. They collect nearly all of Cairo's household waste, bring it back to their neighborhood, and then sort and recycle it.
And their efficiency is... it's off the charts, isn't it?
It's incredible. The Zabaleen are estimated to recycle up to 85% of the waste they collect. That's a rate that far exceeds most formal Western city systems.
But the cost is that they live literally among mountains of trash.
They live and work in the same space, surrounded by dense pollution and refuse. It poses huge health risks, especially respiratory ones, but they provide this essential service because the formal municipal system just can't keep up.
Shifting to Latin America, Rocinha in Rio de Janeiro presents this stark visual contrast with wealth.
It's the biggest favela in Brazil, over 250,000 people. And it's located on these steep hillsides right next to some of Rio's wealthiest neighborhoods.
So you can see the mansions from the shacks.
You can.
Well,
And that proximity just highlights the extreme inequality. You see pockets of progress, even guided tourism, but it's all happening alongside crushing poverty and high levels of armed violence, as the favela is often a battleground between drug factions and militarized police.
and just to round out the top 10, what about the massive settlements in South Africa and Haiti?
In Cape Town, South Africa, you have Khayelitsha. It's huge, over 2 million people. It was historically a black township created under apartheid.
So its roots are in segregation.
Explicitly. And today it faces immense challenges, high unemployment, crime. But the sources really emphasize that it's also this powerful center for community activism and political organizing. The residents are constantly mobilizing to demand better services.
And finally, Soleil in Haiti.
Soleil in Port-au-Prince has about 400,000 people living in chronic poverty with almost no basic facilities. Its location makes it incredibly vulnerable.
Not just to political unrest, but to natural disasters.
Especially natural disasters. The 2010 earthquake caused this massive internal migration, creating these huge tent cities that, well, predictably became permanent slums because the state just lacked the capacity for recovery.
These settlements, and there are so many others, they all signal this deep structural failure in how our cities are growing, which means we have to really understand the causes.
And what's so interesting here is that it's never a single failure. It's a complex, self-reinforcing ecosystem. Our sources point to at least 10 specific economic, social, political, and demographic factors all working together.
Okay, let's start with the most obvious one, the primary engine of growth, rural-urban migration.
It's the main driver. People move to cities for a reason. The promise of better jobs, better schools for their kids, access to services. They are, voting with their feet for a better life.
But the reality they find is different.
The friction happens because many migrants just don't have the specialized skills for the formal urban job market. They arrive, they face intense competition, and they can't find a job that pays enough for formal housing.
So they fall back on family or social networks that are already in the only affordable place, the slum.
Exactly. And this inability of cities to cope brings us to the second driver, a failure of urbanization management.
The local governments are just overwhelmed.
Completely. They don't have the funds, they don't have the planning experience, or maybe they don't have the political motivation to manage this kind of rapid growth.
There was a really striking statistic in the research about this. In stagnant economies, a 1% increase in the urban population leads to almost a 2% increase in slum prevalence.
Yeah, that correlation is stark, and it's an economic spiral. When the formal economy, the taxed, regulated part of the economy, isn't growing, it can't absorb all the new labor.
So workers are pushed directly into the informal economy.
Which requires cheap, centrally located housing, which means they bypass the formal housing market entirely. The government fails on infrastructure, the economy fails on jobs, and the poor get funneled into informal housing.
Which is a direct line to the third cause, poor housing planning.
At its core, it's a simple market failure. There is this huge gap between the demand for housing and the supply of affordable, low-cost options.
Because developers are chasing profit.
Of course, they focus on middle-income and luxury housing. The housing market as a system just marginalizes the poor. And as one of the sources notes, a slum, no matter how precarious, is ultimately better than no shelter at all. It's the market's response to an unmet need.
So that's the market failure. But then there are these deeper structural and political drivers, starting with a legacy of colonialism and segregation.
This is where you see history literally building the foundations for today's crises. Let's go back to Dharavi. It wasn't just organic growth at first.
No, it was a policy decision.
It was. It was established in 1887 when the British colonial government enforced segregation. They expelled all the polluting industries, canneries, noxious businesses, and the poor workers who worked in them, to what was then the northern edge of Bombay.
So they pushed the poor and the pollution out together to the same place.
Correct. And crucially, that settlement got zero colonial supervision or infrastructure investment. So the poor built shanties near their jobs. By the time of Indian independence, the structure was already permanent. You see similar patterns all over the world.
Apartheid in South Africa.
A clear example. It actively created townships like Soweto as racially segregated, poorly serviced labor reserves for Black workers.
And this feeds directly into the massive informal economy that sustains these places today.
The informal sector is both a symptom and a structural cause of their persistence. It is enormous. We're talking 20 to 60% of the GDP in many developing countries.
And in some places, it's the dominant form of employment.
In Kenya, an astounding 78% of all non-agricultural employment is informal. And that ecosystem needs a constant, flexible, low-wage labor supply that has to live close to the city center.
Slums provide that cheap, centrally located labor pool,
cementing this symbiotic relationship with the city's formal and informal economies.
And this is reinforced by what ethnographic studies call the primacy of labor. What does that mean?
It's a really powerful insight. It emphasizes that the need for work, not just shelter, is the main cause of a slum's emergence, its consolidation, and its growth. Residents actively build their spaces to facilitate their jobs.
Can you give us an example of what that looks like on the ground?
Sure. In a favela in Brazil called Suru de Capote, the research showed how families moved there specifically to work in a fishery on the lagoon.
Okay.
They didn't just build a shelter, they designed their homes and the whole community layout to make it easier to clean, store, and process their fish. When you ask them why they live there, they say their work gives them dignity, their citizenship.
So any formal housing plan that doesn't include a ground floor workshop or a place for that potter's kiln is basically designed to fail.
It will fail because it prioritizes the architectural form over the economic function. And this brings us to politics.
Right?
Political interests can actively sabotage upgrading efforts. Local parties often rely on the huge, mobilized voting blocks in slum populations. So any effort to clear or change the settlement can be seen as a threat to their power base.
So if you remove the slum, you disrupt the political patronage network that controls those votes.
Exactly. And that can manifest as corruption or organized rejection of a project. The established power brokers inside a slum, the ones controlling illegal water or electricity, they might actively reject alternative housing options because moving would shatter their influence and their control.
And the last big cause, these massive external shocks, natural disasters, and social conflicts.
These are accelerators. They drive rapid mass migration. Think about the Lebanese Civil War, which forced millions to form new slums as they fled the violence.
Or the Haiti earthquake in 2010.
A perfect environmental example. It didn't just destroy buildings. It created these enormous sudden concentrations of displaced people. They were forced into temporary tent cities that, given the lack of resources and political instability, inevitably became permanent, highly vulnerable slums.
So the challenges inside these places are all deeply interconnected, and they create this relentless cycle of vulnerability. Let's go back to that foundational legal issue we touched on. Insecurity of tenure.
This informality occupying land without de jure or legal rights is a defining characteristic, and its consequences are just profound for the residents and for the city.
So let's clarify that. De facto tenure means you live there and nobody's kicking you out today.
Right. But de jure tenure means you hold a legal title. And lacking that title is devastating because it means residents can't apply for a mortgage, they can't get a formal bank loan, their home can't be used as a financial asset.
It traps them outside the formal capital market.
Completely. And if you can't get a loan, you can't invest in upgrading your own home, even if you want to. Why would you sink your life savings into a house that could be bulldozed next week?
So it discourages any self-funded improvement.
Exactly. And from a city planning perspective, this legal ambiguity is a nightmare. You can't easily acquire the land you need to lay down a mass transit line or a major sewer pipe or build a highway.
Because you don't know who legally owns what.
Right. The informality freezes large parts of the city's development. It can't be integrated into the utility grid because you can't guarantee its permanence.
Okay, let's pivot to the health and safety threats. That kind of density combined with poor hygiene, it has to be an accelerator for disease.
It's a terrifying public health threat. Because of the overcrowding, the bad sanitation, the lack of health services, you see incredibly high rates of infectious diseases.
Like what?
The sources highlight high prevalence of HIV/AIDS, which often hits women disproportionately, as well as recurring outbreaks of cholera, dengue, and, very worrisomely, multi-drug-resistant tuberculosis.
Why are slums being called potential breeding grounds for global drug-resistant diseases?
Because the conditions are a perfect storm for it. Poor water, no waste disposal, high human density diseases jump from person to person incredibly fast. And residents often rely on informal, incomplete, or incorrect antibiotic treatments.
Which is exactly how resistance develops.
It speeds up the evolution of pathogens like TB, creating new strains that are a risk not just to the settlement, but to the entire city and really the global health system.
And for children, the most vulnerable, the malnutrition rates are heartbreaking.
Alarmingly high. Some studies in Indian city slums showed up to 51% of kids under 5 were stunted or underweight.
And it's not just poverty, is it?
Poverty is the main driver, but the research also points to a lack of maternal education on nutrition and faulty feeding practices. For instance, reports from Bangkok slums showed a shocking number of mothers feeding kids instant food instead of regular meals, not always because food wasn't available, but because of time constraints or a lack of knowledge.
Now let's layer physical vulnerability on top of all this. Slums are almost always built in the absolute worst locations.
They are. They're established in the least desirable, most dangerous places because that's the only land available for free. We're talking flood-prone river valleys right next to garbage dumps or on unstable slopes like in Rio.
And the way they're built adds to the danger.
Yes. The construction is haphazard. It lacks proper design, proper materials, quality control. So the buildings themselves are incredibly fragile.
So fires are a huge risk.
A constant immediate risk. The density means a small fire can wipe out a huge area very quickly, and the narrow, unplanned streets mean fire trucks can't get in. And these structures offer almost no protection from earthquakes or floods.
And beyond the environmental hazards, there's the human element, violence, and the whole informal economy.
Yeah, crime rates are notoriously high in areas influenced by the illicit informal economy, drugs, protection rackets, prostitution. The violence is often organized, gang-related, especially in African and Latin American slums.
And women are at a much higher risk.
Immensely so. Women and girls face a disproportionately high risk of physical and sexual violence. This is made worse by things like no street lighting, poor security, and the household income stress that can fuel domestic violence.
Some of the statistics are just horrifying.
In some Nairobi slums, one study reported that up to a quarter of all teenage girls are victims of rape each year.
But it's so important to remember that the vast majority of people there are just doing essential, legitimate work.
That's the critical distinction to make.
Yeah.
Most residents are engaged in necessary, licit, informal jobs. Street vending, recycling, domestic work, handicrafts.
Work the city relies on.
Absolutely. But because it's outside formal labor protections, it means extreme income insecurity, no rights, and this final pervasive challenge, the need to pay regular bribes.
The poverty tax.
That's what it is. You have to pay off local police or officials just to avoid harassment or having your goods confiscated. It creates this deeply exploitative system where the poor are forced to pay just to earn a living. So given all these systemic challenges we've laid out, the corruption, the health crises, the climate threats, it is very easy to feel overwhelmed.
Yeah, it sounds hopeless.
But these communities, out of pure necessity, are also these incredible incubators of innovation. And the Makoko floating school in Lagos, Nigeria, is one of the most compelling recent examples.
So what's the background here? Makoko is a huge, old settlement in Lagos.
It's an old fishing village, built almost entirely on stilts over the Lagos Lagoon. So the whole community is marine-based. They use canoes to get around.
Which means it's incredibly vulnerable to climate change.
Profoundly. Rising sea levels, storm surges, flooding, it's on the front line. The architect, Kunle Adeyemi, saw that the traditional approach of fighting the water just wasn't going to work. The solution had to adapt to the water.
So he designed a school that floats.
An amazing prototype. It was this triangular A-frame structure, 3 stories high, providing about 220 square meters of space.
And it wasn't just designed as a school.
No, it was explicitly designed to be modular and scalable, a blueprint for housing, for markets, for health clinics. The base was an open community space. The second level had classrooms.
And what was so clever about the materials?
It was an exercise in resource-smart design. He used inexpensive, locally available timber, but the genius part was the foundation.
How did it float?
It floated on over 250 recycled plastic barrels, all lashed together. It was this brilliant, low-tech solution designed to simply rise and fall safely with the water level.
It sounds like a perfect architectural solution, but you said the prototype didn't last.
And that's the hard lesson here. The original structure, which served the community for 3 years, unfortunately collapsed in a heavy rainstorm in June 2016.
Wow.
Thankfully, it had been decommissioned, so no one was hurt. But the collapse highlighted a serious flaw in its long-term durability. It couldn't stand up to the weather extremes of the region.
So why did it fail? If they used local materials and worked with the community, why wasn't it stronger? Does that mean the whole approach is flawed?
I think it suggests a flaw in the institutional support for the approach. The design concept was sound, but it was constantly obstructed by these structural barriers.
Like what?
They never got full institutional sign-off. They didn't have access to formal engineering consultants for proper stress testing. And crucially, there was no consistent funding for maintenance or reinforcement.
So the community had the ingenuity, but the formal system failed to embrace it and make it permanent.
Exactly. But the idea itself survived the collapse.
It did.
Oh, yeah. The concept won major awards, like the Silver Lion at the Venice Biennale. Subsequent, more structurally sound versions, MFS II and MFS III, were built and exhibited in Italy, Belgium, and China.
So what's the broader lesson here?
The lesson is that the localized capacity for climate adaptation is already there. But these grassroots innovations are constantly blocked by forced evictions, by elite-driven planning that ignores local knowledge, and a lack of support.
We have to stop seeing residents as just passive recipients of aid.
Exactly. They are essential actors in urban planning. The future of climate architecture isn't just about big budgets. It's about these clever, nature-based solutions using local resources. But, and this is the key, backed by stable engineering and real political will.
Okay, so based on our sources, let's look at how governments have tried to fix this problem over the years. There are 3 primary policy responses, and 2 of them are heavily criticized.
The first and the oldest is slum removal, or clearance. This is the blunt force approach. The thinking is, these settlements are on valuable land illegally, so we just remove them.
Often by force?
Often by force, with very little notice. And the primary critique is that it completely ignores all the root causes we just talked about.
Right. You remove the houses, but you don't remove the need for affordable housing near jobs.
Exactly. The poor still exist. The informal economy still needs workers. They will simply rebuild a new slum somewhere else, or expand an existing one. It solves a land use problem for the city, but it does nothing for the people.
So that led to the second strategy, slum relocation. Morocco's Cities Without Shantytowns program is a big example.
With relocation, you move the residents to free or heavily subsidized formal housing, but it's usually built way out on the edge of the city.
And the critique here is that it treats the slum as just a housing problem, not an economic ecosystem.
It fails to recognize that the settlement is integrated with livelihoods and crucial social networks. You're not just moving a person, you're ripping them away from their job and their support system.
If you move them too far away, they can't afford the commute to their informal job in the city center.
It creates this profound economic and psychological insecurity. We saw this with the Sabarmati Riverfront project in Ahmedabad, India. Over 19,000 families were relocated.
How far?
An average of 9 kilometers away from their original homes. And the relocation was done with almost no consultation about their jobs.
And the result was devastating.
Studies tracked significant drops in income. The extra commuting time just eroded their ability to work. And there was this huge psychological cost of destroying the community ties, the informal childcare, the mutual aid networks.
Okay, so that brings us to the third approach, the one that's most favored today. Slum upgrading.
Upgrading means you keep the settlement where it is and you provide the basics. You give them legal security of tenure and you bring in infrastructure, electricity, sanitation, clean water, paved roads.
And the theory is that if you give people that security and those services, they'll invest in their own homes and the community will transform over time.
That's the theory. But the research shows the long-term results are often disappointing. The sources describe the benefits as ephemeral.
Why? Why do they fail?
It often comes down to a lack of planning for recurrent operational funding and community ownership. For example, in Jakarta, they built communal toilets, but they were quickly abandoned because nobody had budgeted for maintenance or created a system for who was responsible for cleaning them.
So the hardware was installed, but the system to sustain it was missing.
Exactly. And the new infrastructure quickly gets overloaded and fails, and conditions can end up worse than they were before.
This whole issue of integration versus destruction is perfectly illustrated by that redevelopment proposal for Dharavi.
The plan for Dharavi was to replace the whole thing with high-rise buildings, commercial units on the ground floor, and residential apartments stacked above.
Which sounds good on paper.
But it's the classic top-down plan that completely ignores the primacy of labor. The residents' key concern was immediate and economic. How can a small business, a barber, a laundry service, a leather worker, that relies on street-level foot traffic possibly survive on the 10th story of a high-rise?
The formal architecture, which is designed for housing, completely destroys the informal economic ecology that makes the community work.
Precisely. It fails to see that people don't just live in Dharavi, they work there, and the design facilitates that work. High-rises are designed for a middle-class life where you commute out to a job, not for the integrated life of the informal sector.
So if all these modern strategies have such mixed results, how did the US and Europe get rid of their major slums?
The success back in the 60s and 70s wasn't about one single policy. It was a comprehensive effort that combined massive urban infrastructure development with public housing.
And the key ingredient was affordable mass transit.
It was everything: subways, commuter rails, highways. It allowed the poor to live in cheaper, subsidized housing further from the city core, but still reliably get to their jobs.
So the governments prioritized citywide planning to connect work, housing, and labor.
Yes, and that comprehensive investment, backed by national wealth and strong social safety nets, is the critical ingredient that's often missing in the developing world today.
The difference then is whether the goal of the investment is to displace the poor for the benefit of real estate or to empower and connect the poor to the wider economy.
It's the difference between seeing the land as valuable real estate and seeing the human capital, the billion people living in these places, as the city's most valuable, if unrecognized, resource.
This whole deep dive has really shown us this profound paradox. On one hand, slums embody the crushing failure of inequality. But on the other, they showcase this astonishing human resourcefulness, this sophisticated economic organization. The question really isn't whether we can ignore them anymore, is it?
No.
It's about what is the political and planning will to actually guarantee a better, more sustainable future for these communities.
And that brings us to the opportunity, not just the problem. We can't deny that a place like Dharavi generates billions in legitimate economic activity. We've seen the ingenuity of Makoko's floating design or Orangi Town's self-built sewers. So I think formal urban planning has to fundamentally change its starting point.
How so?
We have to shift from treating slum dwellers as just passive recipients of aid or as sites to be cleared. We have to instead find ways to legally recognize, formally support, and fully integrate their proven resourcefulness, their economic strength, and their local solutions into the formal fabric of the city. That is the only way the next Makoko floating school doesn't just rise in brilliance, but actually remain standing permanently for the generations to come.